Sometimes the smallest voice carries the biggest truth. Sometimes a child's innocent question can shatter a grown man's carefully built walls and force him to face what he's been running from his entire life. What happens when a hardened cowboy, who thought he knew every trail and every answer, discovers that he's been the one who was truly lost all along? This is the story of Jake Morrison, a man who spent 37 years believing he was exactly where he needed to be, until a 7-year-old girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile asked him 4 simple words that would change the course of his life forever. It's about the moment when being physically lost becomes the least of your problems, and finding your way home means discovering you never really knew what home was in the first place. Some stories start with dramatic explosions or life-threatening adventures. This one starts with a question so simple, so pure, that it cut through decades of self-deception like a knife through butter. Because sometimes the most profound journeys begin not with a map or a destination, but with the courage to admit you don't know where you're going at all. Jake Morrison had been walking for 3 hours when he finally admitted to himself that he was completely and utterly lost. The admission came grudgingly, like pulling teeth from a stubborn horse, because cowboys weren't supposed to get lost. Cowboys were supposed to know the land like the back of their weathered hands, supposed to read the sky and the wind and the way grass bent in the breeze like some kind of ancient language passed down through generations of men who lived their lives under the open sky. But here he was, standing in the middle of what looked like every other patch of Colorado wilderness he'd seen in the past decade, with his truck broken down somewhere behind him and his cell phone displaying that familiar and infuriating no service message. The mountains loomed around him like sleeping giants, beautiful and indifferent to his predicament. The afternoon sun was starting its lazy descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows that seemed to mock his situation. He'd started the day like any other, heading out to check on some stray cattle that had wandered off from the Henderson ranch where he'd been working for the past 6 months. It was supposed to be a simple job, the kind he could do in his sleep. Follow the fence line, look for breaks, round up any strays, and be back by dinner. But his truck had other plans. The old Ford had wheezed and sputtered to a stop about 15 miles from the main road, leaving him with a choice between waiting for help that might never come or striking out on foot to find his way back to civilization. Being Jake Morrison, he'd chosen to walk. The problem was, he'd been so focused on the broken fence and the missing cattle that he hadn't paid attention to which direction he'd been heading. 1 mile had turned into 3, then 5, and now he was standing in a landscape that all looked the same. Rolling hills covered in scrub brush and pine trees, with narrow game trails that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere at once. He pulled his hat down lower over his eyes and tried to get his bearings. The sun would set in the west, that much he knew, but the mountains seemed to curve around him in every direction, making it hard to figure out which way would lead him back to anything resembling a road. His boots were starting to pinch, and he could feel a blister forming on his left heel. The water bottle clipped to his belt was more than half empty. Jake had spent most of his 37 years moving from ranch to ranch, town to town, always ready to pack up his few belongings and head somewhere new when the mood struck or when staying in one place too long started to feel like quicksand around his ankles. He prided himself on being self-sufficient, on not needing anyone or anything except his horse, his truck, and his own 2 hands. But, right now, self-sufficiency wasn't getting him anywhere except more lost. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent his entire adult life running from anything that resembled roots or responsibility, and now he was literally running in circles trying to find his way back to somewhere he belonged. Not that he belonged anywhere, really. The Henderson Ranch was just another temporary stop, another paycheck, another place to rest his head until the restlessness kicked in again and he felt the familiar urge to move on. He'd been moving his whole life. Moving away from the small town in Texas where he'd grown up feeling trapped and suffocated. Moving away from his father's expectations that he'd take over the family hardware store and settle down with a nice local girl and produce a few grandchildren to carry on the Morrison name. Moving away from relationships that got too serious, jobs that demanded too much commitment, anywhere that people started to depend on him or expect him to stay. Movement had been his religion, change his constant companion. The open road was the only thing that had ever made sense to him, the only thing that felt like freedom instead of a cage. But now, standing in the middle of nowhere with the sun sinking lower and his water running out, Jake was beginning to wonder if all that movement had been taking him somewhere or just keeping him from ever having to stop and figure out where he actually wanted to be. A sound broke through his brooding thoughts. Laughter. High-pitched and carefree, the kind of laughter that belonged to someone who didn't have a care in the world. Jake turned toward the sound and saw something that made him question whether the altitude and dehydration were starting to mess with his head. There, maybe 50 yards away down the slope, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, with blonde pigtails bouncing as she chased what appeared to be a butterfly through the tall grass. She was wearing a bright yellow dress that looked completely out of place in the middle of the wilderness, like she'd been dropped there from some suburban backyard barbecue. Jake rubbed his eyes and looked again, but she was still there, real as anything. And if there was a little girl wandering around out here, there had to be adults nearby. Parents. People who knew where they were and how to get back to civilization. People who probably had vehicles with working engines and GPS systems and all the modern conveniences that Jake had somehow managed to misplace. He started walking toward her, his boots crunching through the dried grass and scattered pine needles. As he got closer, he could see that she had freckles scattered across her nose and was missing at least 2 front teeth. The butterfly she'd been chasing had apparently escaped, because now she was picking flowers, carefully selecting the prettiest ones and adding them to a small bouquet she held in her left hand. When she noticed him approaching, she looked up with the kind of open curiosity that only children possessed. No fear, no wariness, just genuine interest in this tall stranger in dusty boots and a worn cowboy hat who'd appeared out of nowhere. Jake realized he probably looked pretty rough after 3 hours of wandering through the wilderness, but the little girl's expression didn't change. "Are you lost, mister?" she asked, her voice carrying that distinctive lisp that comes with missing front teeth. The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was rude or unexpected, but because it was so perfectly, devastatingly accurate. Jake stopped walking and stared down at her. Such a simple question. 4 little words from someone who probably didn't even know what being truly lost meant. She was asking about geography, about whether he knew which way to walk to find his truck or a road or another human being. But something about the way she asked it, with such innocent directness, made Jake realize she'd accidentally asked the most important question of his entire life. Was he lost? He'd been telling himself for years that he was exactly where he wanted to be. Free. Independent. Unencumbered by the complications and disappointments that came with putting down roots. But, standing there in the middle of nowhere, looking down at this little girl who seemed completely at home in a place where he was completely out of his element, Jake felt something shift inside his chest. Maybe he had been lost for a lot longer than 3 hours. "I might be," he said finally, surprised by the roughness in his own voice. "I might be very lost." The little girl considered this with the seriousness that children brought to important matters. She tilted her head to one side, her pigtails swaying with the motion. "That's okay," she said matter-of-factly. "Everybody gets lost sometimes. My daddy says getting lost is just another way of finding something you weren't looking for." The words hung in the air between them like dust motes in a shaft of sunlight. Jake felt something tighten in his throat, some emotion he couldn't quite name. When was the last time anyone had told him it was okay to be lost? When was the last time anyone had suggested that being lost might lead to finding something valuable? "Is your daddy around here somewhere?" Jake asked, looking around for signs of other people. "Your family?" The little girl pointed vaguely up the hill behind her. "They're having a picnic up by the rocks. Mama packed too much food again, and Daddy said we should share with any hungry travelers we meet." "Are you hungry, mister?" Jake realized he was starving. He'd been so focused on being lost and irritated with his truck and worried about finding his way back that he'd forgotten about the basic human need for food. His stomach chose that moment to growl loudly enough that the little girl giggled. "I guess I am," he admitted. "Come on then," she said, tucking her flowers carefully into the pocket of her yellow dress. "Mama makes the best sandwiches in the whole world, and there's lemonade too. Real lemonade, not the kind from a packet." She started walking up the hill, her small legs moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Jake followed, feeling like he was being led by some kind of tiny, gap-toothed guardian angel. With every step, he could feel something inside him loosening, some tightness he'd been carrying for so long that he'd forgotten it was there. The little girl chattered as they walked, pointing out interesting rocks and flowers, sharing observations about the clouds and the way the light was changing as the sun moved lower in the sky. Her voice was like music, like the sound of water running over stones, and Jake found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in months. As they crested the hill, Jake could see the picnic spread out below them. A man and woman sat on a blue checkered blanket, surrounded by enough food to feed a small army. There was a cooler, several baskets, and what looked like half a grocery store's worth of supplies. The man was playing guitar, his fingers moving effortlessly over the strings while the woman sorted through papers spread out beside her. They looked up as Jake and the little girl approached, and Jake saw recognition in their eyes. Not recognition of him specifically, but recognition of someone who needed help. The kind of immediate, unquestioning welcome that Jake had almost forgotten existed in the world. "Found a hungry traveler, just like Daddy said," the little girl announced proudly. "He's lost, but that's okay because getting lost is just another way of finding something." The man set down his guitar and stood up, extending his hand toward Jake. "Tom Bradley," he said. "This is my wife Sarah, and you've already met our daughter Emma. Welcome to our little piece of paradise." Jake shook the offered hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the firm grip of someone who meant what they said. "Jake Morrison. I appreciate the kindness, but I don't want to impose. I just need directions back to the main road." Sarah Bradley looked up from her papers and smiled the kind of smile that could probably cure minor ailments and mend broken hearts. "Nonsense," she said. "Sit down and eat something first. The road isn't going anywhere, and you look like you could use some sustenance before you continue your journey." Emma had already positioned herself cross-legged on the blanket and was patting the space beside her expectantly. "Sit here, Mr. Jake. I want to show you my rock collection." Against every instinct that told him to politely decline and get moving before it got too late, Jake found himself settling onto the blanket. The sun was warm on his shoulders, and the smell of Sarah's homemade bread was making his mouth water in a way that reminded him how long it had been since he'd had a real meal instead of gas station sandwiches and truck stop coffee. Tom handed him a plate piled high with food, and Sarah poured him a glass of lemonade that tasted like summer afternoons and childhood memories he'd thought he'd forgotten. Emma began pulling rocks from her pockets, each one accompanied by a detailed explanation of where she'd found it and why it was special. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake Morrison sat still. Really still. Not because he was stuck or trapped, but because something about this moment, this place, these people, felt like exactly where he was supposed to be. And that realization scared him more than being lost in the wilderness ever could. The sandwich was the best thing Jake had tasted in years, though he suspected that had as much to do with the company as it did with Sarah Bradley's cooking. As he ate, he found himself drawn into the warm circle of conversation that flowed as naturally as breathing between the three members of the Bradley family. Emma continued her geological presentation, producing an impressive array of rocks, pine cones, and what appeared to be a perfectly preserved bird feather from the seemingly endless pockets of her yellow dress. "This one," she said, holding up a piece of quartz that caught the late afternoon light, "is magic. You can tell because it's see-through but also sparkly. Daddy says all the best things in life are like that. You can see right through them, but they still surprise you." Tom Bradley caught Jake's eye over his daughter's head and smiled. There was something in that smile that spoke of a man who had found his place in the world and was comfortable with it, but not in a way that excluded others. It was the opposite of the restless energy that had driven Jake from place to place for most of his adult life. "Emma's our resident philosopher," Sarah said, gathering up the papers she'd been working on earlier. Jake caught a glimpse of what looked like lesson plans and children's drawings. "She has a theory about everything, and somehow they all make perfect sense." "What do you do for work?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. These people seemed to exist in their own little bubble of contentment, like they'd figured out some secret that the rest of the world was still searching for. "I teach third grade in Millbrook," Sarah said. "That's about 20 miles south of here. Tom builds furniture in our barn, and Emma is currently majoring in rock collecting with a minor in butterfly studies." "And getting lost," Emma added helpfully. "Don't forget my studies in getting lost. I'm very good at it." Tom laughed, a sound that was rich and genuine. She gets that from me, I'm afraid. I've been lost more times than I can count, but somehow it always works out. Sometimes getting lost is the best way to find exactly what you need. The words echoed what Emma had said earlier, but, coming from Tom, they carried the weight of experience. Jake found himself wondering what this man had been lost from, and what he'd found when he stopped running. "What about you, Jake?" Sarah asked. "What brings you to our little corner of paradise?" Jake realized he didn't have a simple answer to that question. The honest answer was that he was just passing through, like he always was, working a temporary job until the urge to move on got too strong to ignore. But, sitting here with these people, watching the way they looked at each other and, at their daughter, the way they seemed perfectly content to share their abundance with a stranger, made his usual answer seem hollow. "I work cattle," he said finally. "Been helping out at the Henderson Ranch for a few months. Was checking on some strays when my truck decided to give up the ghost." "The Henderson place," Tom said, nodding. "Good people. Known Bill Henderson since I was about Emma's age. His father and mine used to trade horses back in the day." There was a story there, Jake could tell. The kind of story that involved roots and relationships and the sort of continuity that had always made Jake feel claustrophobic. But, hearing Tom talk about it, seeing the obvious satisfaction in his voice, made Jake wonder if maybe he'd been looking at it all wrong. Emma had moved on from her rock collection and was now braiding stems of grass with the focused concentration of a master craftsman. "Mr. Jake," she said without looking up from her work, "do you have a favorite place in the whole world?" The question caught him off guard. Jake realized he'd never really thought about it before. He'd seen a lot of places, worked in a dozen different states, watched sunsets over mountains and plains and deserts, but he'd never allowed himself to get attached to any of them long enough to call one a favorite. "I'm not sure I do," he said honestly. Emma looked up from her grass braiding with the kind of serious expression that only children could pull off. "That's very sad," she said matter-of-factly. "Everyone should have a favorite place. How do you know where to go when you need to feel better?" Out of the mouths of babes. Jake felt something twist in his chest, a recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding for years. Where did he go when he needed to feel better? Nowhere. He just kept moving, kept running, kept telling himself that the next place would be different, would be better, would be the place where he finally felt like he belonged. "I guess I just keep looking," he said. "Well, this is my favorite place," Emma announced, gesturing around them at the hillside, the mountains, the vast expanse of sky. "Not just here, but everywhere around here. Home is my favorite place, even when we're not exactly at our house." Sarah reached over and smoothed her daughter's hair with a gesture so tender and automatic that Jake felt something ache inside him. When was the last time anyone had touched him like that? With such easy affection, such unconscious care? "Emma has the right idea," Tom said. "Home isn't really about the building you live in. It's about the people you choose to share your life with, the community you build around yourself." Sarah and I figured that out the hard way. The hard way? Jake found himself asking, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Their happiness seemed so natural, so effortless, that it was hard to imagine either of them having struggled with anything. Tom and Sarah exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations that couples who'd been through things together could have in the space of a heartbeat. "I was a lot like you once," Tom said, and something in his voice told Jake that this wasn't a casual observation. "Couldn't stay in one place for more than a few months. Always convinced that whatever I was looking for was somewhere else, somewhere better. Spent 10 years chasing opportunities and adventures, never settling down long enough to plant even the smallest seed." Jake set down his lemonade glass and really looked at Tom Bradley. Beneath the contentment and the obvious happiness, he could see traces of something familiar. The restless energy that had been channeled into something productive, the wanderer's eyes that had finally found something worth focusing on. "What changed?" Jake asked. "I got lost," Tom said simply. "Really lost. Not just geographically, but in every way that mattered. I'd been working construction, following jobs from state to state, and I ended up in Denver working on a high-rise project. Good money, interesting work, but I was living in a motel and eating every meal out of a paper bag. One day I was walking back from the job site and I saw this little girl, maybe 5 years old, with her father. She was crying because she'd dropped her ice cream, and he just scooped her up and told her they'd get another one, no big deal. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone had cared about me enough to comfort me when I was disappointed. Sarah's hand found Tom's, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. That night I called my sister back home, Tom continued. Hadn't talked to her in 3 years. She told me our dad had been asking about me, wondering if I was ever going to settle down somewhere long enough for him to visit. That's when I realized I hadn't just been moving towards something better. I'd been moving away from everything that mattered. Emma had abandoned her grass braiding and was now lying on her back, staring up at the clouds that were turning pink and gold as the sun moved lower in the sky. "Tell him about how you met Mama," she said. "That's my favorite part." Sarah laughed, a sound that was warm and slightly embarrassed. "I was the one who told him he was lost." "You were working at the library," Tom said, his voice soft with memory. "I'd come in to use the internet to look for jobs, and I looked so pathetic sitting there with all my belongings in a duffel bag that you asked if I needed help finding something." "He told me he was looking for work," Sarah said, "but when I asked him what kind of work, he couldn't give me a straight answer. So I asked him what he was good at, and he said moving. Just moving. So I told him that maybe what he really needed to find was a reason to stay still." Jake felt like he was listening to someone describe his own life from the outside. The constant movement, the inability to commit to anything long enough to see it through, the growing sense that he was running from something rather than toward something. "How long did it take," he asked, "to stop feeling like you needed to run?" Tom considered the question seriously. "Longer than I wanted, shorter than I expected. The thing about running is that it becomes a habit. Even after I knew I wanted to stay, even after I knew Sarah was the best thing that had ever happened to me, I still had days when I'd wake up with my hands itching to pack a bag and hit the road. But Sarah was patient, and this place got its hooks in me." Emma sat up suddenly, grass stains on the back of her yellow dress and a new flower tucked behind her ear. "Mr. Jake, do you want to see our secret place?" "Emma," Sarah said gently, "Mr. Jake probably needs to get going before it gets too late." But Jake realized he didn't want to get going. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the thought of moving on felt more like a burden than a relief. The sun was getting lower, true, but there would be other days, other sunsets. Right now, he wanted to see what had captured the heart of a 7-year-old girl who seemed to understand something about home that he was just beginning to glimpse. "I'd like that," he said, and meant it. Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. She jumped to her feet and held out her hand to him. "Come on." "But you have to promise to keep it secret." "I promise," Jake said solemnly, taking her small hand in his much larger one. The trust in her gesture, the easy way she assumed he would keep his word, made something warm unfold in his chest. They walked together up a narrow path that Jake never would have noticed on his own, Emma chattering about the various wildlife they might encounter and the special properties of her secret place. Tom and Sarah followed behind, carrying the picnic supplies and talking quietly between themselves. The path wound through a grove of aspen trees whose leaves whispered secrets in the afternoon breeze, then opened onto a small meadow that took Jake's breath away. It was completely enclosed by trees and rocks, like nature had conspired to create a perfect hidden sanctuary. A small stream ran through one corner, and wildflowers covered every inch of available ground in a riot of color that seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale. "This is where I come to think," Emma announced, releasing Jake's hand and spinning in a slow circle with her arms outstretched. "And where I come when I'm sad, and where I come when I want to talk to the mountains." "It's beautiful," Jake said, and realized the word was completely inadequate. This place was more than beautiful. It was perfect, untouched, like a piece of the world as it was meant to be. Emma plopped down in the middle of the wildflowers and patted the ground beside her. "Sit," she commanded. "You have to sit still to really see it." Jake sat, feeling slightly ridiculous but also strangely at peace. Emma was right. Sitting still in this place was different from just looking at it. The sounds became clearer the longer he listened. The whisper of the stream, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird he couldn't identify. The smells were cleaner here somehow, pine and earth and growing things. "Do you feel it?" Emma asked seriously. "Feel what?" "The stillness. Not the quiet kind, the other kind. The kind that makes you want to stay forever." Jake did feel it. Something he'd never experienced before, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with ownership or commitment or any of the things that usually made him want to run. This place asked nothing of him except to exist in it, to be present to its beauty and peace. Tom and Sarah had settled on a fallen log at the edge of the meadow, giving Emma space to share her secret but close enough to be part of the moment. Jake watched them watch their daughter, saw the obvious love and pride and contentment in their faces, and felt something shift inside him. "Mr. Jake," Emma said, lying back in the flowers and staring up at the sky, "are you still lost?" The question that had started everything, asked again with the same innocent directness. But, this time, Jake's answer came without hesitation. "No," he said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "I don't think I am." Emma smiled, the gap-toothed grin that had somehow managed to turn his entire world upside down in the space of a few hours. "Good," she said. "Because I think you were supposed to find us today." Sometimes when people are really, really lost, the universe sends them exactly where they need to be. As the sun touched the tops of the mountains and the sky began its transformation from blue to gold to pink, Jake Morrison sat in a hidden meadow with three strangers who had somehow become the most important people in his world, and realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he belonged. The sun had painted the sky in shades of orange and purple by the time they made their way back down the mountain. Tom had insisted on driving Jake back to his truck in their family SUV, and somehow Jake found himself squeezed into the backseat next to Emma, who was still clutching her collection of rocks and flowers and chattering about everything she planned to show him the next time he came to visit. The next time. As if it was a given that there would be a next time, as if Jake Morrison was the kind of man who made plans and kept promises and showed up when people expected him to. The strange thing was, for the first time in his life, he wanted to be that kind of man. His truck was exactly where he'd left it, looking forlorn and slightly embarrassed in the gathering dusk. Tom popped the hood and spent a few minutes poking around in the engine compartment with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd fixed more than his share of broken-down vehicles. "Looks like your alternator belt," he said finally. "Easy fix, but you're not going anywhere tonight in the dark. Sarah and I were talking, and we'd like you to come stay at our place. Emma's already planning breakfast, and I've got a spare belt in my workshop that should get you back on the road tomorrow." Jake's first instinct was to politely decline. He'd imposed enough already, taken advantage of their kindness beyond any reasonable limit. But, before he could voice his protests, Emma grabbed his hand and looked up at him with those serious brown eyes. "Please, Mr. Jake? I want to show you my room, and my horses, and the barn where Daddy makes his furniture. And Mama promised to make pancakes in the morning, and they're even better than her sandwiches." Looking down at her eager face, Jake felt the last of his resistance crumble. When was the last time anyone had wanted his company badly enough to ask for it? When was the last time anyone had made him feel like his presence was a gift rather than an imposition? "I'd be honored," he said, and meant it. The Bradley house was exactly what Jake had expected and nothing like what he'd prepared himself for. It was a rambling farmhouse with wide porches and windows that glowed with warm yellow light. The kind of house that looked like it had grown out of the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. There were signs of real life everywhere, Emma's bicycle leaning against the porch railing, Sarah's herb garden thriving in neat rows beside the kitchen door, Tom's workshop tucked into a converted barn that hummed with the quiet satisfaction of productive work. Emma gave him the full tour, her small hand firmly clasped in his as she showed him her collection of horse figurines, the bedroom window that looked out over the mountains, the kitchen where her mother performed daily miracles with flour and sugar and love. Each room told a story of a family that had put down roots and tended them carefully, creating something beautiful and lasting from the simple decision to stay in one place long enough to call it home. They fed him dinner at a table that bore the scars and stories of years of family meals, and Jake found himself talking more than he had in months. About his childhood in Texas, his years of wandering, the strange restlessness that had always driven him from place to place. Tom and Sarah listened without judgment, asking gentle questions that drew out stories Jake hadn't told in years. Emma fell asleep in her chair during dessert, her head pillowed on her arms and a smear of chocolate cake frosting on her cheek. Tom carried her to bed with the practiced ease of a father who'd performed this ritual countless times, and, when he came back to the kitchen, the three adults sat in comfortable silence for a long moment. "She's taken quite a shine to you," Sarah said finally. "Emma's usually shy around strangers, but she was asking if you could stay forever about 5 minutes after she met you." "Forever's a big word for a little girl," Jake said, but something in his chest tightened at the thought. "Not for Emma," Tom said quietly. "She doesn't say things she doesn't mean. It's one of her better qualities." Later, lying in the guest room that Sarah had prepared with the kind of thoughtful touches that spoke of genuine hospitality, Jake stared up at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what had happened to him. 12 hours ago, he'd been Jake Morrison, drifter and cowboy, a man who measured his life in miles traveled and jobs completed and towns left behind. Now he was lying in a stranger's house, feeling more at home than he had anywhere in years, and seriously considering the impossible. What if he stayed? Not just for a few days to get his truck fixed, but really stayed. What if he stopped running from the possibility of roots and relationships and all the complications that came with letting people matter to you? What if he gave up the freedom of the open road for the deeper freedom that came with belonging somewhere? The thought terrified him almost as much as it thrilled him. He woke to the smell of pancakes and coffee and the sound of Emma's laughter drifting up from the kitchen. For a moment, he forgot where he was, forgot the past 24 hours, forgot everything except the warm feeling of waking up in a house where people were happy to see him. Emma was waiting for him at the breakfast table, still in her pajamas but wide awake and bouncing with excitement. "Mr. Jake. Mama made extra pancakes, and I saved you the best piece of bacon, and after breakfast Daddy's going to fix your truck and then you can decide if you want to stay forever or just for a very long time." "Emma," Sarah said gently, but she was smiling. "Let Mr. Jake eat his breakfast before you start planning his entire future." But Emma's words hung in the air like a challenge, like a question that demanded an answer. Jake found himself looking around the table at these three people who had somehow become the center of his universe in less than 24 hours. Tom, reading his newspaper but listening to every word. Sarah, moving efficiently between stove and table with the graceful choreography of a woman who had found her rhythm in life. Emma, chattering about her plans for the day while systematically destroying a stack of pancakes that was almost as tall as she was. This was what he'd been running from all these years. Not the suffocation and boredom he'd convinced himself he was avoiding, but this. The possibility of being needed, of being part of something bigger than his own restless wandering. The possibility of having people who counted on him to show up, to stay, to be present for all the small daily miracles that made a life. After breakfast, Tom walked him out to the workshop to look at the truck. The belt replacement was straightforward, a 30-minute job that Tom approached with the methodical patience of someone who took pride in doing things right. As they worked, Jake found himself studying the workshop, taking in the careful organization, the well-maintained tools, the half-finished furniture pieces that spoke of skill and dedication. "You built all this yourself?" Jake asked, running his hand along the smooth surface of what looked like a dining room table in progress. "Piece by piece, year by year," Tom said. "Started with just the basic tools and a vision of what I wanted to create. Sarah thought I was crazy at first, leaving construction work to build furniture in a barn. But sometimes you have to trust that what feels right is right, even when it doesn't make sense on paper." "How do you know?" Jake asked. "How do you know when to stop running and start building?" Tom set down his wrench and really looked at Jake. "You know because the thought of leaving hurts more than the thought of staying. You know because you start caring more about what you're building than what you might be missing somewhere else." Jake nodded, understanding flooding through him like water breaking through a dam. That was exactly what was happening to him. For the first time in his life, the thought of leaving hurt. The thought of packing up his few belongings and driving away from this place, these people, felt like tearing away a part of himself. The truck started on the first try, purring like it was grateful to be running again. Tom wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back, but he didn't look satisfied. He looked sad, like a man watching something good come to an end. "Well," Tom said finally, "that should get you wherever you're heading." Jake sat behind the wheel of his newly repaired truck and realized he had no idea where he was heading. For the first time in his adult life, he had a choice that wasn't between one temporary job and another, one town and another, one escape route and another. He could drive away from here and go back to his old life of endless movement and careful detachment. Or he could stay and see what happened when Jake Morrison finally put down roots. Emma appeared at his truck window, still in her pajamas and carrying what appeared to be a care package consisting of more rocks, several flowers, and a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "For your journey," she said solemnly, handing him the package. "But, Mr. Jake? I think your journey should end here. I think this is where you were supposed to find us, and we were supposed to find you." Looking down at her serious little face, Jake felt the last of his resistance crumble completely. This child, with her wisdom disguised as innocence and her gift for asking exactly the right questions at exactly the right moments, had somehow managed to show him what he'd been searching for his entire life. "Emma," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "what would you say if I told you I was thinking about staying? Not just for a few days, but really staying?" Her face lit up like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "I'd say that's the best idea you've ever had in your whole life. I'd say that sometimes getting lost is just the universe's way of bringing you home." Jake turned off the engine and got out of the truck. Tom and Sarah had come out of the house and were standing on the porch, watching this moment unfold with the kind of quiet hope that comes from recognizing something important happening. "Tom," Jake called out, walking toward the house with Emma skipping beside him. "That job at the Henderson Ranch? It was always supposed to be temporary. But I'm wondering if you might know of something more permanent around here." Tom's face broke into a grin that could have powered the whole valley. "As a matter of fact, I do. Been thinking for a while that this place could use a good ranch hand. Someone who knows cattle and isn't afraid of hard work. Someone who might be interested in learning a little furniture making on the side." Sarah was crying now, happy tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. "Welcome home, Jake," she said, and somehow those two words contained everything he'd been searching for without knowing it. Emma grabbed his hand and started pulling him toward the house. "Come on, Mr. Jake. I want to show you where your room is going to be, and all the places we're going to explore together, and where we're going to build your horse a stable." Jake Morrison, former wanderer, former runner, former man who measured his life in miles and escapes, let himself be led toward a future he'd never imagined but had somehow always been walking toward. Behind him, his truck sat silent in the driveway, no longer a vehicle for escape but simply a tool for the occasional trip to town. For the first time in his life, Jake Morrison was exactly where he belonged. And the little girl who'd asked if he was lost had been right all along. Sometimes getting lost was just another way of finding exactly what you'd been looking for your whole life. Sometimes the journey home started with admitting you didn't know where you were going. Sometimes the best directions came from someone small enough to see the world clearly, brave enough to offer help to strangers, and wise enough to know that everyone deserves a place to call home. As Emma dragged him toward his new life, chattering about all the adventures they were going to have together, Jake realized that he'd finally found his favorite place in the whole world. It wasn't a location on any map. It was right here, with these people, in this moment when running away had finally led him home.